You're just a burden. I think it's time you leave." The words landed colder than the hardwood floor beneath Michael Carter's feet, sharper than anything Ethan had ever said before, and for a moment, the room felt too quiet to breathe in. Michael didn't move. He stood near the kitchen island, one hand resting lightly on the edge as if the marble itself was the only thing holding him steady, his eyes fixed on his son, not angry, not even surprised, just quietly searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Ethan didn't look back at him. He stood across the room in a pressed button-down shirt that probably cost more than Michael had spent on groceries that week, scrolling through his phone as if the conversation had already ended. The house was spotless, modern, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine, with floor-to-ceiling windows and sunlight pouring in like it had something to prove, but none of that warmth reached Michael. "Not today. Not anymore." "I mean it," Ethan added, his tone casual, almost bored, like he was talking about replacing an old piece of furniture. "You've been here long enough. I need my space." Michael swallowed slowly, his throat tight, but he still didn't raise his voice. "Your space," he repeated, almost to himself, letting the words settle in the air between them. Ethan finally glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. "Yeah, my space. My house. I worked hard for this, Dad. I can't keep taking care of you." There it was. Not just the dismissal but the assumption. The quiet, confident belief that everything Ethan had came from his own hands, his own grind, his own sacrifices. Michael's fingers tightened slightly against the marble, but his expression didn't change. He had heard variations of this before. Small comments over the past year, subtle shifts in tone. The way Ethan stopped asking for advice, stopped listening, stopped seeing him as anything other than someone who didn't belong in this new version of his life. But this was different. This was final. Ethan slipped his phone into his pocket and exhaled like he had just finished a meeting. "Look, I'll give you a couple weeks," he said. "That's more than fair." "Couple weeks." Michael nodded once, slowly, as if he were accepting terms he had no intention of negotiating. "That's generous," he said quietly. Ethan didn't catch the weight behind the words. Or maybe he didn't care. He turned away, already walking toward the hallway, already done with the conversation, already moving on. Michael stayed where he was, listening to the sound of his son's footsteps fade into the distance, and for a long moment, he just stood there in the silence that followed. His gaze drifted across the kitchen, over the polished countertops, the stainless steel appliances, the carefully chosen furniture. Every detail placed with precision, every inch of the house reflecting success, independence, control. It was everything Ethan had ever wanted, everything he believed he had built on his own. Michael let out a slow breath, almost a sigh, though it never quite became one, because there was something else in that room too. Something Ethan had forgotten, or maybe something he had never truly known. Michael reached into his jacket pocket and felt the edge of an old envelope, the paper slightly worn from time, the contents inside untouched for years. He didn't take it out. Not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes for just a second, as if replaying a memory only he could see, something quieter, something buried beneath all the polished surfaces and confident words. When he opened them again, the house looked exactly the same, but it didn't feel the same. Not to him. Not anymore. And somewhere down the hallway, Ethan Carter was already moving on with his life, completely unaware that the foundation he was standing on wasn't as solid as he thought it was. Michael did not argue, and that was the part Ethan noticed the least, because in Ethan's mind silence meant agreement, weakness, or simply acceptance, but in reality it was something much heavier, something built over years of choosing restraint over reaction, something Ethan had never really understood. Michael moved slowly through the house that afternoon, not like a man being forced out but like someone revisiting a place that had already become a memory. His footsteps measured, his gaze lingering just a second longer than usual on small details that most people would never notice. The corner of the dining table where Ethan used to sit with his homework spread out, the faint scratch near the cabinet from when Ethan was 12 and tried to carry something too big for him, the way the sunlight hit the living room floor in the late afternoon exactly the same way it had for years, unchanged even as everything else had shifted. Upstairs, Ethan was on a call, his voice confident, professional, talking numbers and timelines as if nothing had happened, as if asking his father to leave was just another task checked off a list, and Michael could hear it clearly through the open space. every word reinforcing the same idea, that Ethan believed he had built his life entirely on his own, that every square foot of this house, every polished surface, every carefully selected piece of furniture was the result of his own effort, his own decisions, his own success. Michael paused near the staircase and looked up for a moment, not with anger but with something closer to quiet reflection, because he remembered a different version of that voice, younger, uncertain, asking questions instead of giving answers, a version that had once needed guidance, reassurance, support, and he remembered how quickly those years had passed, how easily they had been replaced by this new confidence that left no room for anything else. He turned away and walked toward the small guest room at the back of the house, the one Ethan had told him he could use for a while, the phrase still echoing in his mind with a weight that was not about the words themselves but about what they represented, a shift in how he was seen, not as a father but as a temporary presence, someone occupying space that could be reclaimed. Inside the room, everything was neat, almost untouched, a bed, a dresser, a small window looking out toward the street where cars passed by without slowing down, and Michael stood there for a moment before sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees as he exhaled slowly, not in defeat but in acceptance of something he had known was coming long before Ethan had said it out loud. His hand moved again to his jacket pocket, feeling the envelope still there, the paper slightly creased but intact, and this time he pulled it out just enough to see the corner, just enough to remind himself of what it held, then slid it back in without opening it, because the timing was not right, because some truths needed to surface on their own. Downstairs, the sound of a door closing echoed through the house as Ethan stepped out, likely heading to a meeting or a dinner, his schedule full, his life moving forward at a pace that left little room for looking back, and the house grew quieter again, the kind of quiet that made every small movement more noticeable, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the subtle shift of air through the vents. Michael stood up and walked back into the hallway, his posture steady, his expression unchanged, and he moved toward the front of the house, stopping briefly near the entryway where a framed document hung on the wall, something Ethan had proudly displayed, a certificate recognizing an achievement, a milestone that marked his rise, and Michael looked at it for a moment before his gaze shifted slightly to the side, to a small detail most people would miss, a date, a number, something that connected more than it revealed. He did not touch it, did not adjust it, just observed, then turned away. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway, and Michael stepped out onto the front porch, the air cooler than it had been earlier, carrying with it a sense of transition that felt almost symbolic, and he stood there for a moment, looking at the house from the outside, seeing it not just as a place but as a culmination of decisions, sacrifices, and moments that had never been fully acknowledged. He knew Ethan believed this was the beginning of his independence, the point where he had finally stood on his own. But Michael also knew something Ethan did not. Something that had been buried beneath contracts, transactions, and quiet choices made without recognition. And as he looked at the house, there was no resentment in his expression, only a calm understanding that the story was not finished yet, that what had been said inside those walls was only the beginning of something much larger, something that would not stay hidden for much longer. Ethan did not close the folder this time, and that small decision carried more weight than he realized, because instead of pushing it aside like everything else that did not immediately serve him, he kept looking, his eyes moving slower now, more deliberate, scanning each line as if the meaning might change if he read it twice, and the confidence that usually defined his posture began to shift into something quieter, something uncertain. The numbers were not random, they connected, they formed a pattern that felt uncomfortably familiar, and the dates placed everything years earlier than he expected, back when he had been just starting out, back when the idea of owning a house had felt more like a distant goal than a reality, and yet here it was, documented in precise detail, transactions recorded with a level of clarity that left little room for interpretation. He flipped another page, his brow tightening slightly, and his mind started doing what it always did, trying to rationalize, to explain, to maintain control of the narrative he had built, because admitting something did not align with that narrative was not something he was used to doing. "This does not make sense," he said, more to himself than to Michael, but the words hung in the air between them anyway, and for the first time there was no immediate response, no quick dismissal, just a pause that stretched long enough to be noticed. Michael remained where he was, his hands resting calmly on the table, his expression unchanged, but his silence was no longer passive, it felt intentional, Like he was allowing something to unfold rather than stepping in to guide it. Ethan turned another page, and this time his eyes stopped completely, fixed on a detail that did not belong in the version of the story he had been telling himself for years, a name, a signature, something that should have been his but was not, and for a brief moment, he just stared at it, as if the act of looking long enough might make it disappear. "This is not right," he said again, louder now, his voice carrying a sharper edge, not anger yet but frustration, the kind that comes from not understanding something that feels like it should be obvious. Michael finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, without urgency. "What part does not look right to you?" The question was simple, but it landed differently than anything Ethan had heard from him before, because it did not challenge him, did not accuse him, it simply asked him to look closer. Ethan exhaled, his grip tightening slightly on the folder as he tapped one of the pages with his finger. "This signature, this is not mine," he said, his tone more controlled now, as if he were presenting evidence in a meeting, something he could analyze and resolve, something that could be explained with logic. Michael nodded once, acknowledging the observation without expanding on it, and that lack of explanation only made the silence feel heavier, more charged, because it forced Ethan to keep going, to dig deeper rather than relying on someone else to provide the answer. He flipped back to the first page again, retracing his steps, connecting details that had not seemed important before, the transfer amounts, the timeline, the structure of the transaction, and slowly, almost reluctantly, new possibility began to form in his mind, one that did not fit neatly into his understanding of how things had happened. "Who signed this?" Ethan asked, and this time the question was direct, his eyes lifting from the page to meet Michael's, searching for something more than a vague response. Michael held his gaze for a moment, not avoiding it, not softening it, just meeting it with the same calm presence he had maintained all along, and then he answered in the simplest way possible, "Someone who made sure you did not have to wait years to get what you have now." And the words settled into the room with a quiet weight that was impossible to ignore. Ethan's expression shifted again, the certainty that had defined him beginning to fracture in small, almost imperceptible ways, because the implication was clear even if the full truth had not been spoken yet, and for the first time, he did not immediately reject it, did not dismiss it as irrelevant, he just stood there, the folder still in his hands, the pages no longer just numbers and signatures but pieces of something larger, something that was starting to challenge everything he thought he knew about how he got here. Outside, the morning light had grown brighter, filling the room with a clarity that felt almost symbolic, as if the space itself was revealing more than it had before, and Ethan remained where he was, caught between the version of his life he had always believed in and the possibility that there was more to it than he had ever considered, while Michael sat quietly, not pushing, not explaining, simply allowing the moment to expand on its own, because he understood something Ethan was only beginning to face, that once a question like this is asked, it does not go away, it grows, it demands answers, and sooner or later, it forces the truth into the open whether you are ready for it or not. Ethan did not speak right away, and that silence stretched longer than anything that had come before, because now it was not just about confusion, it was about something deeper beginning to surface, something that did not fit into the clean, controlled version of his life that he had built so carefully over the years. He looked back down at the folder, his eyes moving more slowly this time, no longer scanning but studying, as if every line might hold a piece of a truth he had overlooked, and the more he looked, the harder it became to ignore the inconsistencies, the way the timeline did not match his memory, the way the financial details suggested involvement that he could not fully account for. "No," he said quietly at first, almost under his breath, then again louder, "No, this does not mean what it looks like," and the words sounded less like a conclusion and more like an attempt to regain control, to push back against a realization that was forming whether he wanted it to or not. He closed the folder halfway, then opened it again, his fingers pressing against the pages as if holding them steady could somehow stabilize the situation, and he looked up at Michael, his expression sharper now, more defensive. "If you are trying to say something, just say it," he said, his tone carrying an edge that had not been there before, not because he was certain, but because uncertainty was something he did not know how to sit with. Michael did not react to the tone, did not rise to meet it, he simply watched his son with the same calm presence, the same measured patience that had defined every moment so far, and when he spoke, his voice remained even. "I am not trying to say anything you cannot already see. And That answer, simple as it was, only made the tension in the room grow, because it placed the responsibility back on Ethan, forcing him to confront the possibility on his own. Ethan let out a short breath, something between a laugh and frustration, and shook his head slightly. You expect me to believe that you? He stopped mid-sentence, the words not fully forming, because saying them out loud would mean acknowledging them, and he was not ready for that yet. He turned away for a moment, pacing a few steps across the kitchen, his mind racing through explanations, trying to find a version of events that would make sense without rewriting everything he thought he knew, and for a brief moment, he found one, something simple, something manageable. Maybe it was just a cosigner, he said quickly, turning back toward the table, his voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. That happens all the time. It does not mean anything, it does not change anything. And he nodded slightly as if reinforcing the idea to himself, as if repetition could make it true. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, and when Ethan finished there was a brief pause before he responded, "Does it look like a cosigner to you?" And the question was not confrontational, it was not even challenging, it was simply precise, directed at the exact point Ethan was trying to avoid. Ethan hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough to reveal that the answer was not as clear as he wanted it to be, and he looked back down at the document again, his eyes returning to the signature, the placement, the structure of the agreement, and this time he could not dismiss it as easily because the more he looked, the more it contradicted the explanation he had just given. "I do not remember any of this," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, and there was something different in it, not just confusion but the beginning of doubt, the kind that does not go away once it starts. Michael nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without judgment. "There are a lot of things people do not remember when they are focused on moving forward," he said, his tone steady, not accusing, just stating something that felt larger than the moment itself. Ethan looked at him again, really looked this time, as if trying to see something he had missed before, something that had always been there but had never seemed important, and for the first time there was no immediate dismissal in his expression, no quick response, just a pause, a gap where certainty used to be. The house felt different now. The same walls, the same light, the same carefully arranged space, but the atmosphere had shifted, as if the foundation Ethan believed he was standing on had started to move. Not enough to collapse, not yet, but enough to make him question whether it was as solid as he had always assumed. And as he stood there with the folder still in his hands, the weight of it felt heavier than paper should, because it was no longer just a document, it was a question, one that was not going to disappear, one that was only going to grow the longer he tried to ignore it. While Michael remained where he was, calm, patient, allowing the realization to take shape at its own pace, because he understood something Ethan was only beginning to learn, that the truth does not need to be forced when it is already written in front of you, it only needs to be seen. Ethan did not speak right away, and that silence stretched longer than anything that had come before, because now it was not just about confusion, it was about something deeper beginning to surface, something that did not fit into the clean, controlled version of his life that he had built so carefully over the years. He looked back down at the folder, his eyes moving more slowly this time, no longer scanning but studying, as if every line might hold a piece of a truth he had overlooked, and the more he looked, the harder it became to ignore the inconsistencies, the way the timeline did not match his memory, the way the financial details suggested involvement that he could not fully account for. "No," he said quietly at first, almost under his breath, then again louder. "No, this does not mean what it looks like." And the words sounded less like a conclusion and more like an attempt to regain control, to push back against a realization that was forming whether he wanted it to or not. He closed the folder halfway, then opened it again, his fingers pressing against the pages as if holding them steady could somehow stabilize the situation, and he looked up at Michael, his expression sharper now, more defensive. "If you are trying to say something, just say it," he said, his tone carrying an edge that had not been there before, not because he was certain, but because uncertainty was something he did not know how to sit with. Michael did not react to the tone, did not rise to meet it. He simply watched his son with the same calm presence, the same measured patience that had defined every moment so far, and when he spoke, his voice remained even. "I am not trying to say anything you cannot already see." And that answer, simple as it was, only made the tension in the room grow, because it placed the responsibility back on Ethan, forcing him to confront the possibility on his own. Ethan let out a short breath, something between a laugh and frustration, and shook his head slightly. You expect me to believe that you? He stopped mid-sentence, the words not fully forming, because saying them out loud would mean acknowledging them, and he was not ready for that yet. He turned away for a moment, pacing a few steps across the kitchen, his mind racing through explanations, trying to find a version of events that would make sense without rewriting everything he thought he knew, and for a brief moment, he found one, something simple, something manageable. Maybe it was just a cosigner, he said quickly, turning back toward the table, his voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. That happens all the time, it does not mean anything, it does not change anything. And he nodded slightly as if reinforcing the idea to himself, as if repetition could make it true. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, and when Ethan finished there was a brief pause before he responded, "Does it look like a cosigner to you?" And the question was not confrontational, it was not even challenging, it was simply precise, directed at the exact point Ethan was trying to avoid. Ethan hesitated just for a second, but it was enough to reveal that the answer was not as clear as he wanted it to be, and he looked back down at the document again, his eyes returning to the signature, the placement, the structure of the agreement, and this time he could not dismiss it as easily, because the more he looked, the more it contradicted the explanation he had just given. "I do not remember any of this," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, and there was something different in it, not just confusion but the beginning of doubt, the kind that does not go away once it starts. Michael nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without judgment. "There are a lot of things people do not remember when they are focused on moving forward," he said, his tone steady, not accusing, just stating something that felt larger than the moment itself. Ethan looked at him again, really looked this time, as if trying to see something he had missed before, something that had always been there but had never seemed important, and for the first time, there was no immediate dismissal in his expression, no quick response, just a pause, a gap where certainty used to be. The house felt different now, the same walls, the same light, the same carefully arranged space, but the atmosphere had shifted, as if the foundation Ethan believed he was standing on had started to move, not enough to collapse, not yet, but enough to make him question, one that was not going to disappear, one that was only going to grow the longer he tried to ignore it, while Michael remained where he was, calm, patient, allowing the realization to take shape at its own pace, because he understood something Ethan was only beginning to learn, that the truth does not need to be forced when it is already written in front of you, it only needs to be seen. Ethan stood still for a long moment, the folder resting in his hands as if it had quietly taken control of the room, and the silence between him and Michael no longer felt neutral, it felt loaded, as if something irreversible had already begun and neither of them could step back from it. He looked down again, slower this time, tracing the printed lines with his eyes as though repetition might bring clarity, but instead it brought something else, something heavier, because the more he read, the more the details aligned in a way that made his earlier explanation harder to hold on to. The dates pointed to a time when he had been struggling to secure approval, when every bank meeting had ended with conditions, delays, or hesitation, and he remembered that period clearly, the stress, the uncertainty, the long hours trying to prove he was ready, and yet the resolution had come faster than expected, cleaner than it should have, and at the time he had accepted it without question because it fit the outcome he wanted. Now looking at the documents again, that smooth transition no longer felt like proof of his persistence, it felt like something had been placed there, something he had not fully seen. "Why would this be in your name?" Ethan asked, his voice no longer sharp, no longer defensive in the same way, but searching, trying to find a version of the truth that would not completely disrupt everything he believed. And the question lingered in the air, waiting. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair, not avoiding the question, not rushing to answer it either, and for a moment he simply looked at Ethan, as if measuring how much he was ready to hear, then he spoke. His tone steady, because at the time it needed to be. And the simplicity of the answer only deepened the complexity of what it implied. Ethan frowned, his mind working through the statement, trying to connect it to something concrete, something he could verify. "That does not explain anything," he said, and this time there was no attempt to mask the confusion, no effort to maintain control, just a direct acknowledgement that he did not understand. Michael nodded slightly as if he expected that reaction. "You were close," he said, "but not close enough for them." And the word "them" hung there, undefined but clear enough, referring to the institutions, the people who had evaluated, who had decided, who had placed limits that Ethan had believed he had overcome on his own. Ethan's grip on the folder tightened again, not out of anger, but out of a need to hold on to something stable as the narrative in his mind continued to shift. "So you are saying I could not get it on my own?" he asked, and the question carried more weight than it appeared. Because it was not just about the house, it was about everything that had followed, everything he had built on top of that first step. Michael did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice remained calm, measured. "I am saying you were on your way, but timing matters." And that answer did not dismiss Ethan's effort, but it also did not confirm the independence he had always assumed. It placed him somewhere in between, in a space that was far less certain. Ethan looked away, his gaze drifting toward the large windows, the light now brighter, sharper, illuminating the room in a way that made every detail more visible. And for a moment he said nothing, his thoughts moving through memories he had not revisited in years, the meetings, the phone calls, the sudden approval that had felt like a breakthrough at the time. And now, with this new context, it began to look different, not completely undone but redefined. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked finally. His voice quieter now, less guarded, and the question carried something new, not just confusion, but a hint of something else, something closer to realization. Michael's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a subtle acknowledgement of the weight of that question. "Because you did not ask," he said, and the answer was not defensive, not dismissive, it was simply direct, and it settled into the space between them with a clarity that was hard to ignore. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something begins to make sense even if you are not ready for it to. And he looked back down at the folder, the pages no longer just documents, but pieces of a story that had been incomplete, a story he had been telling himself. Without realizing there was more to it. The house felt different again, not just as a place but as a symbol, something that had represented independence, achievement, control, and now it carried an additional layer, something quieter but far more significant, something that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. And as Ethan stood there, the certainty he had relied on was no longer intact, replaced by a growing awareness that what he believed to be entirely his own might have been supported in ways he had never fully acknowledged, while Michael remained steady, present, allowing the truth to continue unfolding at its own pace, knowing that once it had begun, it would not stop until it was fully seen. Ethan did not move for several seconds after those words, and the silence that followed no longer felt like something he could control or escape from. It felt like something pressing in on him, forcing him to stay present, forcing him to think in a way he had not allowed himself to in years, because now the question was no longer whether something had happened, it was how much of it he had misunderstood. He lowered the folder slightly, his grip loosening as his eyes drifted back to the pages, and this time he was not just reading them, he was trying to reconstruct something, trying to align the documents with memories that suddenly felt incomplete. And the more he tried, the more gaps he found, moments that had once seemed insignificant now standing out in a way they never had before. "I remember the meeting," he said slowly, almost thinking out loud, his voice softer, less certain. "They said I needed more time, more proof, they were not ready to approve it yet." And as he spoke, his gaze remained fixed on the paper, as if the words might be written there somewhere. Michael listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, allowing Ethan to piece it together on his own. And then a week later, everything changed. Ethan continued, his brow tightening slightly. "They called me back, said it was approved, no conditions, no delays." He paused, his breathing shifting as the memory became clearer, more detailed. "I thought I convinced them, I thought I proved I was ready." And there was something fragile in the way he said it now, not pride but uncertainty, because the belief that had once felt solid was beginning to feel like an assumption. Michael's voice came quietly, not interrupting but guiding just enough to keep the realization moving. "You did convince them," he said. "Just not in the way you think." And that distinction landed deeper than anything else, because it did not dismiss Ethan's effort, but it redefined the mechanism behind the outcome. Ethan looked up at him quickly, his eyes searching, not defensive this time but trying to understand. "What does that mean?" he asked, and there was no edge in his voice now, only a need for clarity. Michael held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly toward the folder. "Look at the date on the transfer," he said, and Ethan immediately dropped his eyes back to the page, scanning until he found it. His finger tracing the line as his mind connected it to the timeline he had just recalled. The date was there, precise, unmistakable, and it aligned exactly with the gap between rejection and approval, the space where everything had shifted without explanation. Ethan's breathing slowed, his posture stiffening slightly as the implication settled in, and for a moment he did not say anything, because the connection was becoming too clear to ignore, too direct to dismiss. "That is not possible," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction, they sounded more like a reflex than a conclusion because the evidence in front of him was no longer something he could easily reinterpret. Michael did not challenge the statement, did not push against it, he simply asked, "What part of it does not make sense?" And once again, the question placed the responsibility back on Ethan, forcing him to articulate what he was resisting. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand moving to the edge of the counter as if grounding himself. "If this is what it looks like, then?" He stopped again, the sentence unfinished, because finishing it would mean acknowledging something he was only just beginning to accept. He looked around the kitchen, the same space that had felt so familiar just hours ago, now carrying a different weight, every detail sharper, more defined, as if the environment itself was reflecting the clarity he was being forced to face. "Then I did not do it alone," he said finally, the words quiet, almost reluctant, but once spoken, they did not leave room for retreat. Michael nodded once, not as a confirmation, but as an acknowledgement that Ethan had reached that point on his own. The realization did not come with immediate understanding. It did not resolve everything, but it shifted something fundamental, something that could not be undone, because it changed the way Ethan saw the foundation of his own success. He looked back at the folder again, the pages now carrying a weight that extended far beyond the numbers and signatures, and for the first time, he was not trying to defend his version of the story, he was trying to understand the one that had always existed beneath it, while Michael remained steady, present, allowing the truth to continue revealing itself piece by piece, knowing that the moment Ethan fully saw it, there would be no going back to what he had believed before. Ethan stood there longer than he realized, the folder still in his hands but no longer the center of his attention, because the weight had shifted from the pages to something internal, something that could not be set down or closed, and the words he had spoken the day before echoed back to him with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, as if he were hearing them for the first time through someone else's voice. He glanced toward Michael, who had not moved much at all, still calm, still steady, and that stillness now felt different, not passive, not distant, but intentional, as if it had always been there, waiting for this exact moment to be understood. Ethan took a slow breath and set the folder down on the counter, carefully this time, not dismissively, and the small action carried a shift in how he was approaching everything in front of him. "I was wrong," he said, and the words did not come easily, they were not rushed, not softened, just direct, and they settled into the room with a weight that matched the silence around them. Michael looked at him, not surprised, not relieved, simply present, and that response or lack of reaction made the moment feel more real, because it was not being shaped or guided, it was simply allowed to exist. Ethan continued, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Not just about yesterday, about all of it," and as he spoke, his eyes moved briefly around the room again, but this time there was no confusion in his gaze, only recognition, the kind that comes when something has been fully seen and cannot be returned to its previous form. "I thought I did everything on my own," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it now, no attempt to protect that belief, only a statement of what he had understood and what he was now letting go of. Michael nodded once, acknowledging the words without interrupting, giving them space to stand on their own. "And maybe I needed to believe that," Ethan added, his tone thoughtful, reflective. "Maybe that is what kept me moving forward." And for a moment there was something close to clarity in that realization, because it did not dismiss his effort, it did not erase what he had built, it simply placed it in a more complete context. Michael's voice came calmly. "Believing in yourself is not the problem," he said. "Forgetting how you got there is." And the words were not harsh, not critical, they were measured, and they landed with a kind of precision that made them difficult to ignore. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, taking that in, and for the first time there was no immediate response, no quick explanation, just a pause, a moment of processing that felt necessary rather than uncomfortable. "I told you to leave," he said again, and this time the words carried a deeper weight, not just as a statement but as something he was actively confronting, something he could not distance himself from. Michael did not respond right away, and when he did, his tone remained even. "You said what you believed at the time," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, no attempt to hold the moment against him, just a simple acknowledgement of where things had been. Ethan nodded slowly, but the acceptance in that gesture was not about excusing the moment. It was about recognizing it fully without minimizing it. He looked back at Michael, meeting his eyes in a way he had not done before, not from a place of authority or control, but from a place of understanding. "You are not a burden," he said, and the words were deliberate, chosen carefully, not as a correction, but as a truth he was now stating clearly. The room remained quiet after that, but it was not the same kind of silence as before. It was not tense or uncertain. It was settled, as if something had reached its natural conclusion. Michael gave a small nod, not in acceptance of the words, but in recognition of what it had taken to say them, and he stood up slowly, his movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing about the moment required urgency. Ethan watched him, not with confusion, not with distance, but with a new awareness of who he was standing in front of, not just a presence in the house, not just a figure from his past, but someone who had shaped the foundation of everything he had built in ways he had only just begun to understand. Outside, the light had shifted slightly, the morning moving forward as it always did, unchanged by what had happened inside. But for Ethan, something fundamental had changed, not in the house, not in the documents, but in how he saw them, and as he stood there, he understood that the real weight of what he had learned was not about the past, it was about what he chose to carry forward from it. Because some realizations do not just end a moment, they redefine everything that comes after.